to the book of Esther and read from chapter 20 of the story. We kind of pick up the story here in the middle of the book of Esther, and it says, after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than all of the other nobles. And all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. And therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is, the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and a month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. And then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger, and he gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." And then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned, and they wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors in the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month of the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command. When Mordecai learned of all that edict had issued in the citadel of Susa, the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was bewildered, and he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. And when Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. And then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. And so Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. And he also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and to plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. And then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the peoples of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. but you and your father's family will perish. But who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" And then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Well, how many of us are of Dutch descent today? If so, raise your hand. Well, just a few of you. And if so, then perhaps you've heard this story. Back in the 1930s, there was a man whose name was Casper. And he lived quietly with his family in Holland, that is, the Netherlands. He was a clockmaker, and he was known to have a rather open and loving heart. And he and his family, they were Christians. And so they sought daily to minister to the downtrodden that they found around them without any regard for race or for religion. And yet his family's resolve to be a blessing to others, it endured what you could call a great test. You see, their home, it had always been this haven for those who were in need. But World War II came, and suddenly their house became much more than just kind of a place for hospitality. Casper ten Boom and his daughters, Betsy and Corey, they were compelled by their faith to provide, as it were, a hiding place for Jews and for others who were being slaughtered by the Nazis. And as a result, they became part of what was known as the Dutch underground movement. So at any given time, there could be dozens of refugees living illegally in their safe house. But then came the fateful day. It was February the 28th, 1944, when the Gestapo broke through the doors of their home. 30 refugees that they were housing, as well as Casper the father, and as well as the 2 daughters, Betsy and Corey, as well as 3 other relatives. They were all arrested and they were all imprisoned. 10 days later, Casper the father, 84 years of age, he dies in prison. And yet when he was asked if he was willing to possibly die for helping the Jews, you know what he said? He said, "It would be an honor for me to give my life for God's ancient people." Well, subsequently, daughters Corey and Betsy end up, over the next 10 months, in 3 different prisons. During that time, they share their faith with their fellow prisoners. Eventually, Betsy dies, as did their brother, as well as their nephew. 4 of the ten Boom family give their lives for protecting the Jews. Only Corey survives. And yet the tale of the ten Boom's vibrant faith, as we heard told in Corey's amazing book called what? The Hiding Place. It gives a perspective on God's upper story that few else have ever been able to tell in such a powerful way. And that sort of segues us today into chapter 20 of our story. You see, long before Hitler, long before the Nazis came along, the Jews who lived 2,500 years ago faced sort of some similar kinds of circumstances. In fact, as we get into the story of Esther today, we'll notice that anti-Semitism, or prejudice against the Jewish race, it was just as alive and well back then. And yet what we're also going to get to see today is God's amazing provision for his people, the Jews. Folks, let's recall that Xerxes, the guy that we heard about, the Persian king in power at the time, he was literally master of all that he surveyed, including the Jewish kingdom of Judah that had been carried off into exile about a century before. And yet, as we learned last week, after about 70 years, due to an edict that was issued by one of Xerxes' royal predecessors, the Jews finally had this opportunity to be able to go back home again. And so 50,000 Jews do get to go back home. And they go back to rebuild their beloved temple. But meanwhile, there's a lot of other Jews. And the rest of these exiled Jews, they simply continue to assimilate themselves further into the Persian culture by staying there. Such was the case for literally dozens of different kinds of exiled peoples. Needless to say, Xerxes, his empire was powerful, it was prosperous. So in what may have resembled the toga party from the 1970s movie Animal House, you might remember that, for 7 days, he puts on this huge shindig to showcase all of his vast wealth to all of his military and his civic leaders throughout the land. It was sort of this all-you-can-eat, all-you-can-drink gala affair held there in the king's magnificent gardens. And to cap off the whole event, what does he do? He summons his beautiful wife, Vashti. And she is to come and be put on display. Look what I have, the king says, to all of the drunken guests. Now, very likely this queen, she had been treated as sort of eye candy for a lot of years. But this time, she refuses to come, to acquiesce to his demands. Big mistake. Kings don't like to be refused. So Xerxes, he strips her of her crown. He banishes her from his presence. After all, kings also don't like to be embarrassed, do they? But even more, they don't like to be queenless. So Xerxes, he commissions this huge kingdom-wide beauty pageant, and young women from all over the province, they come and they're whisked into the king's harem. And for a year they receive royal beauty treatments. And one such young woman was a Jewish girl named Esther. She had been raised by her cousin Mordecai, and it seems almost immediately that Esther begins to win everyone's hearts, including the king's. The minute he sees her, it was game over. And so Xerxes, he makes Esther his new queen, even though he doesn't know yet that she's a Jew. We think about this lower story event, and we see these kinds of things in fairy tales, these kinds of romances in Cinderella and Camelot. But this story takes a decidedly upper story turn. You see, Esther, she's about to be in the right place at the right time. And the reason why is going to extend all the way down to you and to me. And sure, folks, down in the lower stories of our lives, coincidences, yeah, they happen all the time. They come and they go. But in the upper story, are they coincidences? Is it an accident that a Jewish girl in exile finds herself wearing the queen's crown? Well, soon after, cousin Mordecai overhears a plot, as we heard, to kill the king. And when he passes this news along to Esther, the king is rescued, and the conspirators, they're hanged. And fortuitously, the royal scribe records Mordecai's service in the annals, the records of the king. After all, in the upper story, God knows that this little piece of information is going to be very important later on. However, we also learn about another central figure in today's story. He's an evil villain, and his name is Haman. And he just happens to be King Xerxes' right-hand man. Little Haman's head, it begins to swell. He's in this high position, and he loves the way all of the other king's officials fawn over him. Everyone, that is, except Mordecai. And because Mordecai, a Jew, refuses to kowtow to him, Haman is enraged. In fact, his pride is so offended that he decides to exact his revenge by tricking the king into issuing a decree to exterminate Mordecai and the entire Jewish population of Persia. And so Haman cast this lot, a dice, or a pour, as we read. And from that roll of the dice, he chooses a day of unfettered violence against the Jews. And upon hearing of this, Mordecai, he goes in the sackcloth and ashes, and he goes and sends word to Esther, asking her to beg the king for his mercy. And of course, Mordecai knows that the king doesn't know that Esther is a Jew. And even more, remember what happened to Queen Vashti? Well, Esther did. And because of that fact, as much as she wanted to be able to go to bat for her people, she's not sure that even if she does, it's going to do any good. Because if you go in front of the king unrequested, unbidden, uncalled for, you might just mysteriously disappear. And maybe that's when Mordecai got this upper story kind of glimpse. Why was it the case that back when they stayed behind in Babylon, Mordecai and Esther, when all of their other Jewish friends returned to Jerusalem? And why did Vashti refuse the king's request to go when she was summoned? And why was Esther chosen, though she was a Jew, to be the new queen? And why did Haman have it in for the Jews? Well, Mordecai's reply to Esther reveals why all of these supposedly random events occurred. But who knows, Esther, but whether you have been called to this royal position for such a time as this. Yeah, just as the Ten Booms family's response that we heard a little bit ago, so was Esther's response. You know what? If I die, I die. And so she and Mordecai, they prepare themselves for this very dangerous mission. And what do? They fast. And they pray. And so she does approach the king unbidden. And what should have been certain death is greeted how? With another coincidence. The king tells her that she can request anything miraculously up to half of his kingdom. Just remember, the same God who hardened Pharaoh's heart in the days of Moses can soften this king's heart. So that very night, what does she ask? Well, she requests a dinner with the king and Haman, his evil right-hand man. And she asks the two men at that dinner if they can hold another dinner upcoming. And Haman, of course, was very elated because, he gets this exclusive right to be there with the king and the queen. He doesn't see yet what's coming. And so they go from that meal, and he even builds a pole upon which to impale Mordecai. And yet it seems that kings with full stomachs, they must not sleep very well. Because Xerxes, he's up that night burning the midnight oil, and he's looking through all of the records of his royal decrees when he happens to come across the account of Mordecai's report. that saved his life. And he realizes, as he thinks to himself, this act of loyalty, it hasn't been rewarded. How should I honor such a faithful servant? In fact, ironically, he puts this question to Haman. And arrogantly assuming, Haman does, that he's the man in question, Haman dreams up this big, elaborate celebration. But you know what we've been discovering throughout the story? That God has a sense of humor. And God's sense of humor shows up again as shortly thereafter, Haman finds himself, through clenched teeth, having to put the king's royal robes on his arch nemesis, Mordecai. And having to lead Mordecai through the streets singing his praises. And then not long after, to add insult to injury, God's sense of humor, it shows up again, because at the second banquet that the queen requested, Haman, he's basking and being there, the center of attention with the king and the queen, when Esther, she springs her trap. She exposes Haman's evil plot to destroy she and her people. And for the first time, she reveals that she is a Jew. And the king, he is so upset that he storms out of the room. He leaves Haman there alone, begging Esther for mercy. And in another one of those so-called bad luck situations, Haman, he manages to stumble into the queen, and he falls on top of her just as the king returns to the room. And when Xerxes sees his beloved queen underneath Haman, well, that's the last straw. He orders him to be put to death for attempted rape. And even more, he has Haman impaled upon the very pole that Haman intended for Mordecai. How ironic, right? Just a coincidence. But you know what? Even more, he appoints Mordecai to become the same person as Haman. Mordecai takes Haman's vacated position, and in another sort of quote-unquote lucky situation, a twist in the story, remember the king's decree to kill all of those Jews? Let's recall, as we learned last week, such decrees cannot be undecreed. And yet the king can enable Mordecai to issue a counter decree that provides the Jews an opportunity to be able to protect themselves. And so ironically, the day planned for the Jews' destruction, it actually becomes the day of their deliverance. For on the 13th day of the month of Adar, non-Jewish people from all over the 127 provinces of Persia, they do attack the Jews. And it was a bloodbath. Huh? It was a bloodbath carried out by the Jews against their attackers. Over 75,000 Persians died that day, including 10 sons of Haman. And so the very next day, they celebrate this tradition that's lived on down to this very day. It's called the Feast of Purim. It comes from the word pur, which means dice. And it's celebrated every year on March the 10th as a reminder to the Jews of God's upper story, that nothing happens by chance, that everything is sovereignly planned by God. So what are a couple of takeaways that you and I can take away from this story for our lives, folks? Well, first off, Esther's story, it reconfirms what we've been learning over the last 20 weeks of the story. It's the great upper story plan of God, that over and over again, we've witnessed God's faithfulness, that in spite of idolatry and sin and all the bad choices, that God continuously plans and leads his people. He's got a plan for them, and he's got a plan for us. And nothing is going to keep God's plan from happening. In fact, when we look back over the story, don't we see it again and again? That our God is such a great God, that his plan was working with Adam and Eve when they ate the forbidden fruit there in the garden. His plan was working when Joseph was in prison and when Moses escaped slaughter as a baby. And his plan was working when Gideon was hiding out down in that wine press and was called, and when Samson was blinded and when he was made a spectacle. God's plan was working when King Saul tried to kill young David. And God's plan was working when David's grandson, Rehoboam, caused the kingdom to split into two. God's plan was working when the Israelites had to be carried off into exile. And God's plan was working when Persia defeated Babylon and therefore allowed for God's people to go back home. Folks, if you take away nothing else from the story today, then take away this. God is still working even when we cannot see his plan. God's plan is working during a time of foreclosure or unemployment or financial meltdown. God's plan is working despite the ever-present threat of terrorism. And God is working his plan even through the frustrations and the hardships of your own families. So our first takeaway from Esther today is that faith is the substance of things hoped for. It's the evidence of things that we cannot see. God's plan is working even when you can't see it. Will you trust his upper story to be working out in your lower story? But there's a second takeaway, and that is, throughout the story, we've seen one Old Testament foreshadowing after another. Glimpses, we might call them, of Jesus, the Messiah who is to come. In Moses, the lawgiver, we see the foreshadowing of Jesus, the fulfiller of the law. In Adam, the first man, we see a foreshadowing of the one who the Apostle Paul calls Jesus, the second Adam. For if the many died, Paul wrote, for the sin of the first Adam, then how much more did God's grace and the gift that came come by the grace of the second Adam, Jesus Christ? In David the king, through whom God makes an everlasting covenant, we see a foreshadowing of Jesus, the covenant fulfiller. In Boaz, the kinsman redeemer for a woman named Ruth, we see the foreshadowing of Jesus, our kinsman redeemer. In Melchizedek, the great high priest of the Old Testament. Well, the book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus is our great high priest. And so it goes on and on that we see that Esther is another foreshadowing of Jesus. For just as God used Esther's faith and courage to be able to deliver her people, so God would use Jesus to deliver us. Both were sent into the world at exactly the right time. For Esther, Mordecai said, but who knows but whether you've been called to your royal position for such a time as this. For Jesus, Paul says in Galatians 4:4, but in the fullness of time, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to set us free who are under the law. How about one final takeaway, folks? In the story of Esther, you know what? We see an antidote to hate, and that's the courage of love. It takes a lot of courage to love selflessly and completely like Esther did, or that Ten Boom family did, because such unconditional love carries with it a lot of risk, doesn't it? The risk of rejection. And sure, anybody can hate, but only those with this God-forged backbone have the mettle and the courage to be able to love regardless of that. And only Christ's love is the kind of love that allows us to take a stand, even if it means that we could die. Like Casper and Corey and Betsy ten Boom. Esther was willing to jump into the middle of a battle that's been raging since before the Garden of Eden. Because there in the story of the Garden of Eden, as we learned in the beginning, because that serpent, the devil, led Adam and Eve into sin, came our need for a Savior. And so God promised that one day the seed from that woman, Eve, would be the seed that would bruise the head of the serpent. Do you remember that? Who did that seed become? Jesus. And so the serpent, Satan, has been trying to defeat God's redemptive plan ever since. He's been trying through the Hamans and the Hitlers of the world to bring down God's plan. Again and again, in the story of Moses, when Pharaoh tried to kill all of the baby boys. In the story of Jesus, when Herod tried to kill all the baby boys. What do you think was happening? It was the enemy trying to snuff out the seed that would bruise his head. This has been going on, this battle, since the very beginning. And you and I, we may never be in a position where joining this battle becomes a matter of life and death. In fact, the worst thing that might happen to you in taking a stand might be a little ridicule. People might think that you're some kind of Bible thumper for reading your Bible in the break room over your lunch hour. Your neighbor might think you're a Jesus freak for participating in a march for Jesus. Your unsaved friends might think that you're a fanatic for sharing your faith with them. And yet, as Mordecai told his cousin Esther in a moment when it really counted, but who knows but whether you've been called to such a position for such a time as this? Could that be us today? Have we been called to take a stand in the gap? Just like those hardy Dutch folk, the ten Booms, for such a time as this, to manifest to our neighbors and our communities a courageous kind of love that is so desperately needed in these days. Could God be calling you to join the battle? You see, folks, Esther, she was willing to roll the dice because she knew who controls the dice. As Solomon said so long ago, yeah, we may roll the dice, but it's the Lord who determines how they roll. And all of God's people said together,